Well, I don't know how many years on this earth I got left. I'm gonna get real weird with it.
All right, my beauties and bees, who is ready to get weird with it? Because things are getting really weird today. As we often do, we have to return to the great lost kingdom of Tartaria today. And it's going to get really weird. And I almost feel like I need to preemptively apologize for the direction that some of the stuff is going to take here for us, but I digress. Let me first start by introducing the channel that we're looking at. And let's see here. Now, we did just recently do a Tartaria video, but it was Hans Wormhat, so it was a special case, because Hans Wormhat is a special case. We're getting back to just some standard Tartaria nonsense today, so... This is a channel called Jason Jack, and this channel is established to be a light to the Lord Jesus Christ, our Creator and Savior, and the Bible in which His truth is revealed. He talks about his book, about Jesus, and to be fair, early on, his channel was like literally... very Jesus focused, very Christian focused. But as he moved along, he became more and more obsessed with what he calls Satan's little season and the fall of Tartaria, the 1,000-year reign of Christ, and a whole lot of weird. As you see, he too got into aliens, which, you know, I like aliens, but languages of angels. Then he started getting into things that are Tartaria adjacent, amazing architects, and then the timeline video. Are we now in Satan's little season? That's an hour-long video. We're not going to watch it, but we are going to dig into this orphan train thing because I have so many questions. Has the Millennium Kingdom been hidden within the Byzantine Empire? So yeah, you kind of get an idea where he's going with this stuff. And from there on out, all his content is about Satan's little season and the fact that we're living in like a demonic era of time. Like weird stuff too, like Liberty Bell and Thanksgiving. Continental drift, evolution, casting pearls before swine, all the medical symbols. Statue of Liberty. It gets really weird, but we are going to focus on their weird direction they take things in with the orphan trains here. There's two videos on orphan trains. The first one's 43 minutes and the second one's 21 minutes. I don't know if we'll get to the second one or not, but I figured we need to watch the first one first. And he kind of explains what the Satan's little season and all that stuff is a bit throughout the video. But if I need to elaborate more, I've watched more of his stuff and kind of felt it out. But we'll make it through this. So let's go. It's insane asylums and orphan trains. Is there a connection to the little season?
Hey guys, I want to do a video today, and I want to look at insane asylums, orphan asylums or orphanages, and orphan trains. And we're going to look at a fair amount of slides looking at these old world buildings that were used for orphanages and to house the mentally insane. And
starting over,
I want to answer several questions about these buildings, about orphan trains. Why did we see all of this really pop up and become popularized in the late 1700s, early 1800s throughout the rest of the 19th century? Why was this specific time period so packed full of these insane asylums, these orphanages, these orphan trains? Well, let's start with this example. And as we go through this, I think you're going to see a picture develop. Not what our history books tell you, not what...
I used to have a muted alert. I used to have like an alert that would that you could type in exclamation point mute, and it would say, "Bree, you're muted."
History tells us about the orphan trains, about insane asylums, why they were used, why all these orphanages popped up during the 1800s, but show you truly that this was a transitional period between the millennial kingdom of Christ and Satan's little season. Satan's Little Season, I proposed in my last timeline video, began in 1776 at the time of the founding of the Illuminati. Those who were waiting.
1776 was when Satan's Little Season started. Just keep that in mind. That's a weird year, but...
For Satan to be released from the abyss, from the bottomless pit. The people during this transitional time leading up to this point knew exactly where they were in the timeline. They knew that they were at the end of the millennial kingdom of Christ. They were part of that era, but they rejected Christ, rejected the gospel, did not like that kingdom, and were waiting on a future kingdom to pay homage and allegiance to. This is who Satan used to carry on Satan's Little Season beginning in the late 18th century. Those who rejected Christ and rather placed their allegiance to Luciferian doctrine as they were anticipating this season to begin. And
what? So this is the part where I was like, so they're rejecting Christ, right? So, but they lived in the 1,000-year reign of Christ. That's where that's not making sense to me.
And I want to show you just one example of this transitional period and a person in history and how this works. But when you look at all these old world buildings, these cathedrals, these government buildings throughout
John Laval, are you Luciferian?
the world, in these examples, orphan asylums, insane asylums, look at who they say the architects were. Look and see who founded them, and then do a name search and begin to learn more about these people. Almost always you will see that the people that are described as founding these buildings.
It's this. The funniest thing about this whole video is that it's mostly him saying, "Look at these buildings. People in the 1800s couldn't build these buildings. People in the 19th century didn't have the technology to make a building this fabulous." That's his whole argument.
Were Freemasons within the Illuminati, that these buildings had Freemason Masonic rituals at their initiations for their repurposing. And let me show you this as an example. The McLean Asylum, named after John McLean. John McLean was a merchant who was born 15 years before 1776. This is at the tail end, in my timeline, of the millennial reign of Christ, as we are entering the last few years before Satan's Little Season began. It says John McLean was born in 1776.
No, he was born in 1761. You just highlighted it, and then you said 1776.
That date is unknown, and his birthplace was likely Milton, Massachusetts, where his mother's parents had settled. Let me show you a couple of things here. One, McLean was a merchant who partnered with Isaac Davenport. He worked from offices on Long Wharf while ingraining himself in Boston society, becoming a member of the Massachusetts Boston chapter of the Masonic Society. So John McLean here was a Freemason. And he shows you he's a Freemason by how they pose for pictures, the symbols that they use. But they did this so that people would know that they were part of this new transitional period into Satan's Little Season, and that they did not give allegiance to Jesus Christ, but rather Satan. These are Satanists. They are those who were awaiting the
Freemasons are Satanists. Yeah. That's old news, I guess.
Quote, enlightened one, the light bearer, because they...
I know, right? Brian Stevens like, what? Masons build buildings? Amazing revelation.
They rejected Christ and the things of his kingdom. And they're showing you who they're giving their allegiance to.
I don't even care that he's a Mason. Let's read a little bit about this guy that he's skipping over, though. Was an American merchant, most famous because of his will. The will was subject of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court case, Harvard College versus Amori, which led to the prudent man rule, left a bequest to Massachusetts General Hospital, which led to McLean Hospital being named after him. He established the McLean Professor of Ancient and Modern History, a professorship at Harvard University. So it doesn't sound like he did anything nefarious. Sounds like he was. I mean, he was a merchant, so obviously he was working within the confines of capitalism and succeeded. So, congratulations, Merchant McLean, I guess.
So he donated a large sum of money, and that's for these hospitals and these mental health institutions, and that's why his name was. That's why the Insane Asylum was named after him. He gave a large endowment to Mass General Hospital, and it says he left a bequest to Mass General Hospital, which led to McLean Hospital being named after him. But look at this. And he also established the McLean Professor of Ancient and Modern History, a professorship at Harvard University. So not only did
I get it. He's going to link the threads. This guy was rewriting history and re-educating people in these hospitals.
Used for insane asylums in Boston, but he became a professor of ancient and modern history at Harvard University, one of the most prominent universities in the world, an Ivy League school. And he was a professor teaching ancient and modern history. Do you think this Freemason who's teaching ancient history is going to tell you about the millennial kingdom that he was on the
If this guy knew it was best for him, he'd put out his own seasoning and call it Satan's Little Season to put on your food?
tail end of, and whose parents, who probably were also Freemasons within the joining of the Illuminati, do you think that he is going to tell his students?
Well, you saw that I maybe you didn't see it at Fox, but there was another video about that showed all the the medical symbols, like the staff of Horus or whatever that they use. It's like, oh, it's all Satan. Hospitals and doctors are the devil.
It's at Harvard University about the millennial kingdom of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Or do you think he is going to say that didn't happen and that it was a 1,000-year period, that very little happened, it was filled with plagues, and let's refer to it as the Dark Ages? That this is who wrote our history books, that university students in the 18th and 19th century, after the establishment of the United States, people like this are who rewrote history and our history books that we have in libraries today.
So they created modern history.
But that just shows you.
After the fall of Tartaria, they invented the Age of Exploration and the Dark Ages and all that, and the Middle Ages, all fabricated to cover up the Golden Era, the Golden Tartaria era under the 1,000-year reign of Christ.
That
yes,
there's this period of time. John McLean is an example, but you can look at hundreds of others of people who were part of this transition in Satan's little season. And Satan used these people, these families, all the famous families that you hear, the names that you still hear today, that founded, all these world governments and buildings and healthcare systems and educational system, all of these old world buildings that are named after these people. These all come from this transitional period after the millennial reign of Christ. These people were part of the Illuminati. The Freemasons were a sect of the Illuminati that joined the Illuminati at the time Satan was released from his prison and began the little season. And people like him were put into prominent positions over the first several decades.
So does Satan pick him personally, or how does this work?
Decades of this little season throughout the world, in the educational system, in the government systems, in the healthcare systems, you name it, in the churches. They crept in unawares within the churches. Satan's tentacles was throughout all worldwide institutions.
I didn't even know Satan had tentacles. They never draw him with tentacles these days. Can you show us what Satan's tentacles look like? These shitheads want to bring back the Dark Ages. Well, they think there was this glorious golden age before 1776.
During the first few decades to get his season kicked off with a bang. And those who knew the millennial reign of Christ and opposed this transitional time that did not go along with the narrative, these were people that they had to deal with. And their children, they had to indoctrinate so that John McLean could teach them about the ancient history of the Dark Ages rather than the millennial reign of Christ and the modern history of Satan's little season, which was to come. Let's go to another slide.
So the idea is, again, that there was no Dark Ages, no Age of Exploration. All of that was fabricated by John McLean and forced on the public, and the people who resisted got locked in insane asylums, which is why there were so many to be re-educated, and their children were taken and put on orphan trains. Now, that's where we're going with this, just to be clear.
It's a building that our history books say was built in 1790 in Charleston, South Carolina, to be used as
this is
an
insane.
Orphanage. Just 14 years after the United States declared independence. Do you think within that period of time of the founding of the United States that this structure could be built and used to house orphans? No.
Yes, I do. You don't have any idea about the massive labor force that we had in when slavery was legal to build giant structures like this and make them all fancy and pretty. We've had like there's the church in the background, the steeple. This guy has to know we've had steeples for hundreds and hundreds of years, church steeples that are really tall. It's not like a new concept. Of course, he thinks everything started, our whole world like hit the reset button in 1776. So go figure.
Now, this is an old world building. This was built well before 1790. This was built during the millennial kingdom of Christ. But now, during this early transition of Satan's little seed,
I love mushrooms on my pizza too. I tried to talk everybody and get anchovies, but nobody would. Maybe someday.
This building was repurposed to be used as an orphanage. And we'll talk about why there were so many orphans during this time, and talk about why so many people were going crazy, quote, losing their mind, and had to be housed in insane asylums.
People weren't going crazy and losing their minds. Just like I said towards the beginning, people were. During the Enlightenment or post-Enlightenment, and the doctors wanted to have a diagnosis for everything, and sometimes like normal things, like again being a woman, were just like, oh my god, this person is insane, they're hysterical, or having depression, or having anxiety, all that sort of stuff. It's all lock them away. So, yeah, the asylums were full, and the doctors wanted aberrations to study because we were learning medicine. Terrible time for patients, important time for medicine nonetheless.
Here's another orphanage set to be built in the early 1800s in New York. And again, the same type of old world structure, architecture that we see in a lot of buildings, the Romanesque type, the buildings architecture you see right here, but around it you just see dirt roads, you see people, there's no technology, no cars, but obviously no construction equipment, but yet they want us to believe that this was built in the early 1800s.
Okay, and he acknowledges that this is Roman style. How long ago does he think the Roman Empire was? But he thinks that the Roman buildings are part of this millennial reign of Christ too. So like the Roman buildings and these buildings are the same age and built by the same society, right? Like it wasn't that the founding generation of the U.S. Modeled themselves after the Roman Empire and their architecture. It was that they were literally part of it. It like all happened together. And well, in 1776 forward, we repurposed these old buildings to be our modern orphanages and stuff, and insane asylums. Yeah.
And for the purpose to house orphans. And this is a picture of the orphan asylum in New York in the late 1800s. But it's not just the United States. This was worldwide that we saw this transition. This rebellious time, this transitional period in the early time of Satan's little season was a historical time of rebellion. You see all the wars that were going on in our history books at that time. The French Revolution, for instance, and all the Napoleonic Wars that you see throughout several decades between many, many countries throughout Europe, Africa, Russia, into Asia. It had nothing to do with France, but it's labeled the Napoleonic Wars. But this was...
What do you mean they had nothing to do with France? Who do you think those countries were fighting for or against? Right? Who do you think in the Napoleonic Wars? You're like, oh no, France wasn't involved. What?
Basically a period of rebellion. And we see right here, this lunatic asylum was founded in the early 1800s in Glasgow, Scotland. And does this look like a building that was built by these people here with cows?
Yes. No, the cows didn't build it. Cows don't build things. So they may have had some oxen involved in the construction. But have you seen some of the cathedrals and stuff in Scotland? There's some beautiful architecture. That's some amazing architects in Scotland. Scotland was ahead of its time as far as building structures that were able to withstand the elements. But yeah, it's a beautiful building, and again, stuff built in during and post Enlightenment, especially dealing with medical stuff. A lot of money was pumped into early on. A lot of money was pumped into setting up these not just for mental health stuff, but just doctors in general was treating all sorts of medical cases. But the crown even was interested in investing in such technology, because before this, remember, people would just die of plagues, and people would suffer from diseases in the streets and run rampant, and they wanted to understand why. So a lot of money was pumped into healthcare at this time. Oh, you mean the French Emperor Napoleon, right?
The dome cathedrals, the associated buildings, the walls, the gates leading up to this old world structure, they try to tell us that this was built in Glasgow, Scotland, to house the mentally insane. That is insane in and of itself. For them to think that we would believe such a thing. But during this little season of deception, the world has been deceived. And the lie that's been told about all this is so big that people buy it.
Is it Tartarian cow juice, Robin?
Here's another orphan asylum that was built in the 1800s in Grand Rapids, Michigan. They say this was built in the 1800s to house orphans in Grand Rapids, Michigan. This is a postcard of it in 1912. This no longer stands here because after that, guess what? A fire happened.
So I gotta tell you, dude, also, when you're talking about orphanages, it's weird how you're like dodging talking about the church, which usually ran and financed a lot of these. As you can see, there's crosses on the tops of these buildings, right? These were generally, the Catholic Church was heavily involved, so was the Anglican Church, in programs to help orphans, because that was one of the expectations that when people donated to the church, that they were donating to orphans. So these buildings were financed, and that's part of the reason why they're so beautiful too. It wasn't just pumping money into medicine. It was hospitals and orphanages were funded by churches, and thus had just exuberant budgets to do whatever they wanted with it, and hire the artisans of the day to construct the finest looking buildings to feed gruel to orphans, and
it burnt to the ground. And you'll see that narrative so many times about these old world buildings. They're either destroyed, they destroyed by fire, destroyed by wars, or simply they were not needed anymore, and so they were demolished so that something modern could be built in its place. You see these narratives time after time after time. We can't build this today. We can't build something like this. The way that this was built, with the materials used, cannot be duplicated.
Right? Like St. John's kind of gives it away. I agree, Brian. It's like, no, they think an ancient Tartarians built this, Dave. Yeah, ancient society that lived during the millennial reign of Christ, a golden era of 1,000 years that ended in 1776, and now we covered up what we call the Dark Ages, and the Age of Exploration and stuff like that. The period also, the 1,000-year reign also coincides with like the Roman Empire and things like that. That's all part of this greater global empire that covered the world, called Tartaria. And they had advanced technology, and it was all interconnected trade and everything. And all of a sudden, the mud floods happened. Everything was buried and destroyed, and humans started over again, crawling out of the mud. But these buildings, these ancient buildings, like he'll call them old world buildings and things like that, we dug them out of the mud. We didn't build them. We dug them out of the mud flood. And like Roman ruins and stuff are also from the same time period, that were destroyed by the same event, but they were not covered with mud. But there are some that were covered with mud. It's very complex. But there was a big mud flood, is the important thing to remember about Tartaria. Was it the flood of Noah?
But they want you to think that in the 1800s, during the horse and buggy time, that this could be built.
Yes.
Here's another insane asylum in Paris this time. And you can see the massive structure here with the fountains, the gardens, the walls, the gates, something that's kind of described in the Bible, when you see...
And you can see it says royal on the name here, so this was funded by the crown, because as I was mentioning before, The churches and the crown were very interested in healthcare at this time. It was a new concept, and it was the future, and it was salvation. Healthcare was salvation for people coming out of how many years of plagues and war and just disease ravaging society. And healthcare comes along, yes, they were very interested in financing it and put a lot of money into it, which is why they can afford big fountains and fancy gardens outside their asylums. And some asylums are still like this day, big fancy buildings. And also, when it comes to mental health care, that's not a bad idea to have gardens and fountains and stuff. I can tell you personally that having those access to those kind of spaces makes it much easier for someone to flourish.
Within a city, and you see the walls and the gates that people enter and leave through. This is that type of structure. This is old world architecture here. This whole complex is old world in its layout. But they will
see they're old world, and that means that it was from before the mud flood.
Tell you that this was built in the early 1800s for the mentally insane in Paris. Here's an orphan asylum in London Orphan Asylum, said to be built in 1828, and you can see, again, very
Roman pillars, so it must be ancient, old world buildings.
Few people outside. The amazing architecture, this Romanesque type architecture, the huge marble columns, something that can't be built at the time they said it could, and
why?
For the reason they said it could.
Why?
Here's another.
They just couldn't build it. It's one thing when they're like, they look like a pyramid in Central America, and some racist guys like, oh yeah, brown people couldn't build this. Or look at even the pyramids in Egypt. Oh, these had to be built by white people. But it's even funnier when they're like, humans in the 1800s couldn't build architecture like ancient Rome. Impossible. It's like ancient Rome. It's a Roman. That was Roman style with the pillars and stuff, right? This is not Roman style. This is more, what would you call this? Eastern. This almost looks Eastern Orthodox style to me, but with the way that the domes and all the spires and stuff.
London Bedlam Insane Asylum. This was said to be built in the 18th century in London to house the mentally insane. And you can see the beautiful grounds.
Oh, that's Bedlam. Well, that's one iteration of Bedlam. Bedlam was rebuilt a couple of times, in a couple of different locations too. But it is the quintessential madhouse, and the fact that it has that at this point when this version of it was built, because it goes way back. Bedlam goes way back. I watched a video on the whole thing, the whole history of Bedlam, because I'm weird. I'm into that sort of stuff, and how it started off and where it ended up. And I believe this would have been like the new location that was built in the 19th century. And it looks like they did use the architecture of the time to build this. What do you call this? Is this Gothic architecture? Byzantine style? I'm not sure what you'd call it.
The gates leading up to these domes, these spired buildings. You can see this Gothic cathedral in the background. There is no way that this was built at that time by those people for that purpose. This is the old world angelic architecture of the millennial reign of Christ.
Angelic architecture? Was that built? I mean, it was built by angels? I think you just got your question answered about who built it, guys.
That after the season ended of the millennial reign on earth and Satan's little season began, that those that were in allegiance with Satan after he was released from the Bible,
you need to stop trying to make Satan's little season happen, bro.
This pit began to take over, usurp, steal these buildings and everything that was in it for their own purposes. This was used as an insane asylum at the beginning of Satan's little season in London, England. This housed those who transitioned from the millennial kingdom of Christ into Satan's little season that did not go along with the new narrative that was being printed, that was being told, and that the history books were being rewritten. These were for the people who did not go along with it. The incurable from knowing the past and refusing to go.
Where are you getting this from? I mean, I know it's like rectally sourced, but like you're coming up with these theories on your own. But based on what? The incurables. Where's the documentation of the incurables? Is that just a term you came up with? Like Satan's little season, like the 1,000-year reign of Christ that you think is in the past now, which most Christians think is in the future, I guess. But and now we're in Satan's season.
To the false narrative of what it was. The Dark Ages, what they say, when they knew it was the millennial reign of Christ. And so they were labeled insane. They were labeled religious zealots. There were probably also those that...
Reminds me of Ken Ham saying, why couldn't they have steel and cranes to build Noah's Ark? People were smarter thousands of years ago with no soap and toilet paper, etc. Imagine actually trying to fact check everything he says and provide a real historical context. It would take years, Brian Stevens. I know, right? Maybe I bit off more than I can chew with this one. This dude should be in Bedlam. Yeah. Well, in Bedlam was kind of a nickname for it, too. It's like Bethhaven, Bethel. Let me see. I don't want to get it wrong, so. It's been a while. Bedlam Hospital. Yeah, Bethlehem Royal Hospital. It started off as an almshouse.
The undesirables, maybe, that had mental handicaps and stuff, and they were all thrown in here together during this early transition of Satan's little season. They were tortured. They were experimented on medically. They were put in torture devices and restraints, almost like you have prisoners of war trying to...
So he sees like old mental health like treatment techniques, which were awful. Again, we talked at the beginning too. It was awful to be a patient at this time, but it was a golden age of understanding medicine and healthcare for a lot of conditions. So, but yeah, as far as the way the patients were treated and experimental services provided, things like electroshock therapy, things like the straitjacket, the rubber room, and all that stuff were innovated during this period of time. So he's looking at those things and being like, oh, these were obviously torture devices to get people to believe the 1492 narrative.
Re-educate them. If they didn't go along with that, they did lobotomies. They did other things to try to change their memories. This is what was going on at that time and the reason why. And their children were taken from them. There were cities, towns throughout the world. Houses were broken up during the early decades of Satan's little season, during all these periods of wars that we see in our history books. These were actually part of the rebellion from Christ and his millennial reign, and those who transitioned into Satan's little season who still held the gospel of Jesus Christ.
I'm going to have a hard time walking away from this one, guys. I'm going to have a very, very hard time walking away from this and not just continuing to go through these videos and explore this narrative, because this is wild to me.
And were believers and trusted in his word and carried on the good news into Satan's little season. This is who were placed in these insane asylums. They were doing this to try to stamp out the past, label it as the Dark Ages, so that they can...
Basically, what he's saying is that insane asylums were used to hold Christians who believed in Jesus' reign, and that their children were stolen from them.
Rewrite history and transition into a new era. And their children were taken from them, placed in these orphanages, like this one in Los Angeles that they said was built in 1843. They were placed in these orphanages, and these were basically indoctrination centers.
And this place is called Saint what? Saint, I'm sure it's Saint something, just judging by all the crosses and the fact that it was in California in the 1800s. The construction of this building was funded by the Catholic Church, would be my assumption. And if you don't think the Catholic Church had the funding in 1834 to construct big fancy buildings and hire the best artisans at the time, you're just not familiar with the history of the Catholic Church and how long they've been taking their tithings from the people the people of how would you say, of Roman descent.
These were led by people who were part of Illuminati, the Freemasons that found these buildings, repurposed them for their own goals and intentions in Satan's little season.
Found the buildings again, buried in the mud. They had to dig them out. Had to dig them buildings out of the mud floods.
These were indoctrination centers all across the world to re-educate the youth who are coming out of the millennial kingdom of Christ and within the first few generations into Satan's little season that had heard of the millennial reign of Christ to say, no, that was the Dark Ages. That did not happen. And indoctrinate them in all of Satan's deception that we see in the world today. But this is an orphan asylum in Los Angeles, California. In 1843, it said it was built. But this, when you hear the gold rush of California in 1849, like the San Francisco 49ers, the football team named after the 49ers that went out to...
When you say I should have been a phycologist, like, are you talking about like the study of like algae and stuff? Or did you mean to say...
explore and to find...
Yes, I'm not opposed to being a phycologist. I just didn't know what it would have to do with studying orphan asylums, Brian Stevens. Oh, okay. Psychologist, yeah. I'm more likely to be a psychology patient than a psychologist.
Gold in the late 1840s. This is what they were truly looking for. This is what they were after. They were looking for gold within old world buildings like this. They were looking for gold and silver and precious stone.
So, to clarify, the California Gold Rush. The California Gold Rush was not digging for gold. It was digging for old world Tartarian buildings to dig out of the mud, and they would find treasure inside. They would find treasure inside.
That had not been found yet by those that founded the United States and had not gotten that far west. There was a wild rush as more and more of these old world buildings were found all throughout the United States that California was the last to be hit. And the gold rush that we see in our history books, once again, this false history, this false narrative, this is actually what people were going out to try to find. Structures like this and try to loot and raid the contents within it.
So yes, the California Gold Rush was when we rediscovered the Tartarian buildings. Now, usually he hasn't mentioned the mud flood here at all, but usually they're dug out of the mud flood.
Here's another orphan asylum in New York City. And again, over and over, you see the cathedral-like architecture. And they
almost like they were financed by the church, because the church did collections under the understanding that they would take care of orphans with the money that they were receiving. So they used the money to build luxurious palace-like orphanages because they received a lot of money. And again, the crown did the same thing.
Want us to believe that this was built at that time for orphans. This is a bird's eye view of the Georgia State Insane Asylum, the sanatorium. And you can see, again, the old world buildings. This was built in the Millennial Kingdom and transitioned into something else, repurposed into insane asylums during the early period of Satan's little season. You can see the Romanesque architecture, the domes, the manicured gardens, the fountains, the waterfront views, the tree-lined streets, and the associated complex within this. This was not built for the insane, to rehab the insane and those who have lost their mind.
I think because you're confused about what a sanitarium is. I think. I mean, that's going to be the bottom line here. Sanitariums, I guess I'm thinking of sanatoriums, but yeah, so let's see. Sanitarium. Yeah. Sanitas means health. So I think these are just like regular healthcare facilities. What's the difference between a sanitarium and a sanatorium? Sanitarium and sanatorium are often confused interchangeably, but there are some differences. Sanatorium, the term sanatorium is more commonly used to refer to a medical facility to treat tuberculosis. Okay. And then the word sanitarium. Sanatoriums were often located in rural areas and were built to maximize exposure to sunlight and fresh air. Yeah, but what's this? I want to know about a sanitarium, because I don't think sanitariums were always meant like mental, like asylums. I think it just mean, yeah. Here it says here that synonyms for Merriam-Webster says synonyms for sanitarium are hospital, hospice, and sanatorium. So I think he is assuming that at this time that this whole facility was dedicated to mental health, but I think this was just like a regular hospital.
For those, this was built for something completely different within the Millennial Kingdom of Christ, but was then repurposed by Freemasons, by the Illuminati, for those who remembered the millennial reign of Christ in their past, and when they couldn't make them, quote, lose their minds and their memories of that past, they put them into these type buildings, quote, insane asylums, and experimented on them, or did that to try to actually, through drugs or surgery, to change their memories, to see if they could change their memories. This is an orphan asylum.
Tell me this is not like the juiciest conspiracy. Come on, guys. Satan's little season. The 1,000-year reign of Christ is being replaced by the Dark Ages. I love this. This is so insane.
In Moscow, that the history books will tell you was built in 1778, 2 years after Satan's little season. There's no way that this was built in the late 18th century. This reminds me of the White City in Chicago from the Chicago World's Fair in the 1870s, that they say was built in 2 years and then destroyed after the World's Fair because it was temporary structures. The Chicago World's Fair buildings was old world Millennial Kingdom architecture, just like this is in Moscow. This was not built, obviously, for orphans. This was repurposed by the Illuminati and the Freemasons, who
repurposed by the Illuminati?
Who had locked up or placed the parents of the parentless orphans in insane asylums, and then took those children throughout the world and put them into these old world buildings that transitioned into, quote, orphanages, but rather they were indoctrination centers. And here is an actual picture of the, quote, orphan asylum in Moscow. But this was not built, this riverfront, beautiful, magnificent building was not built as a charitable building to house orphans. Here's another
so you can see
orphan center. No, this is an insane asylum. And you see, they're all the same. They just use some of the old world buildings to house the parents during this transitional period, and then they use some others to house the children. They broke up families throughout this transitional period of the late 18th century into the 1800s.
So, bringing everybody up to speed. So when, in 1776, when the reign of Christ ended and Satan took over, the people who refused to renounce the reign of Christ were put into insane asylums, which were made from old world buildings, repurposed, or into orphanages, which were made from old world buildings, repurposed.
Hundreds. They broke up families to erase their memories of the past, to give them and indoctrinate them on a different history, and to indoctrinate them into the ways of Satan's little season. This is an insane asylum in Toronto, Canada. And I think it was established, they say, in the early to mid 1800s, just like all of these are said to just about.
Canadians can't build structures like this. They build everything out of logs, held together by the strongest maple syrup. Right? Tell me I'm wrong.
Here's another one in Ontario. And you can see, again, in the forefront, you see horse and buggy. You have some water features here. You have this huge building here. And these picturesque grounds. I mean, just the manicure of the field is impressive. With all the
Canadians can't mow their grass like this. This is just madness. Have you never been to Canada? It's igloos, as far as the eye can see. They live in little ice huts, right? They can't build stuff like this.
The people there's no way that these people at that time, horse and buggies, built this in the 1800s for an insane asylum. They did not use...
Homie, they're just bricks. They're just bricks. You can tell they're just bricks. I could go out and lay bricks right now without any previous knowledge. I could go out and lay bricks to build a wall. With previous knowledge of someone else who had been laying bricks before them, and someone else who laid bricks before them. I could build fancier brick structures with different kinds and shapes of bricks baked, which is just, again, bricks are just squares of clay, baked squares of clay. I'm not even kidding. They're just baked squares of clay, or I don't know if you call it clay, I guess, but anyway, they're baked. They're man-made. So, and we've been making them for a long, long time.
They did not build this for mentally insane people. This was found, repurposed, and those that didn't go along with Satan's little season and the change of history, the change of the narrative, this is where they put them, in places like this. Which gets us to the orphan trains. So during the late 1700s, early 1800s, all these things were going on throughout the world. And we see this in the United States with all these insane asylums, all these orphan asylums popping up where families were being divided, parents placed into the insane asylums, the orphans placed into the indoctrination centers, the orphanages. And so there was child trafficking going on well before orphan trains. They just transported them in different ways because there wasn't.
And he's right here. I'm going to take a quick break to talk about orphan trains for a minute, just so you guys can kind of get a feel for what they are. So orphan trains were the result of a lot of factors. They were coming. The first orphan trains came from New York City, and they were children that arrived in New York in the 19th century to work. They were it was a child labor workforce. And jobs became scarce. Some bricks are clay, Brian Stevens. I didn't want to oversimplify it because some bricks are. There's other methods to make bricks too. Am I going past noon? What time is it there? I usually go for about 3 hours, so I got about 45 minutes of the show left. Speed. I saw you had something scheduled this morning too, but I digress. It's up to you if you want to compete against me. I mean, I'm bringing some like hot, fresh conspiracy right out of the oven for you. The fresh, hot conspiracy, the orphan train. So, but it's the same influx of like Irish immigrants that you saw in the 1830s through the 1850s, actually up until the 1860s in New York, in Boston, that produced this orphan class of this orphan workforce. There are a few tragedies more heartbreaking than being an orphan, but in the 1800s in the United States, that tragedy brought with it an unimaginable dimension of loss, abuse, and violence. Orphanages were established to save children from the streets, but they often became places of horror, and homelessness on the street offered no less risk of misery. The first orphanages in the U.S. was established in 1729 in Natchez, Mississippi, for white children orphaned as a result of the conflict between Indians and settlers. Orphanages grew at spectacular rates in the eastern United States between 1830 and 1850 in response to health epidemics, mostly cholera, tuberculosis, and influenza, war, and influx of immigrants, as we talked about just a second ago. The Irish were coming in pretty hot and heavy during this time period, and crushing poverty. Booming industrialization and mechanization also played a significant role in the growth of orphanages. Although child labor had always been common and remained so all during the 1800s and early 1900s, there was such an influx of immigrant children in the 1800s that it created an oversupply of child labor. Many children unable to find work were left destitute and homeless or in orphanages. Many children were placed in orphanages because their parents could not afford to feed them and care for them. In fact, from 1847 to 1869, a review of the Protestant Orphan Asylum in St. Louis, Missouri, revealed that only 27% of the children were full orphans. 69% of the children had one parent, the other parent being deceased or absent. The single parents were equally divided among fathers and mothers. 4% of children had both parents. And then there was a lot of fathers that didn't know how to take care of children, whose spouses died during childbirth, things like that. Also, during the last half of the 1800s, American Indians were facing extermination of their families through war, disease, epidemic, and displacement and destruction of their culture and their land. The government oversaw institutional removal of Native American children from their parents, tribes and communities to boarding schools, orphanages, and mission schools to indoctrinate them into white culture. They were not allowed to speak their native tongues, practice their native ways, and were beaten and abused to break their spirit. The adoption of Native children by white families was promoted, and Native children were adopted by white families at a much higher rate than any other children in the nation. See the posted link, Kill the Indian, Save the Man. Let me pop back over and check in with you guys. Okay, I love it, yeah. LOL, it took me a minute to process. Ember, what did Ember say? I've laid a few bricks. They were usually pretty cuddly after. Yes, at least for the other kinds don't have the crush strength for buildings of that size. Concrete bricks might, but they would be later in that timeline. Yeah. Concrete architecture really started in the 1920s, if I recall correctly. Around 1850, the population of orphans in the East Coast rose to such an extent that 5% of New York City's population was estimated to be abandoned children. A public crisis ensued that resulted in the creation of 3 large charitable social institutions. The Children's Village, founded in 1851 by 24 philanthropists. That's a word I struggle with. A Children's Aid Society established in 1853 by Charles Loring Brace, and later the New York Founding Hospital. Institutions were supported by wealthy, socially minded donors and were operated by professional staff. Coincidentally, the nation's first animal shelters were also established at this time. So humanities were really pulled into place at this time, is what it sounds like. Together, these institutions fostered a program to place their growing number of abandoned children in homes across the country. Some children were pre-assigned through in-person or mail-in applications. In these applications, interested foster families could specify age, gender, personality type, even hair and eye color. But many were put on trains called orphan trains, baby trains, or mercy trains, and transported across the country, where they stopped at various cities where posters had been billed announcing the arrival of orphan trains. When the trains stopped, children were essentially paraded into a hall or place designated as the place of distribution, and the children took turns walking across the stage, giving their names, singing songs, reciting poems, or addressing the crowd to make an appeal for their own adoption. Sometimes people even prodded them, felt their muscles, or looked to see if their teeth were good, because they were looking for farm help. Basically, they were looking for people to help on the farms, or I imagine some of them were looking for children to abuse as well, and they were just brought to them in a parade. Babies were the most desirable. The older the child was, the harder it was for he or she to be placed. Children older than 14 were always challenging to place because of concerns that they were too set in their ways or might have bad habits. Children who were physically or mentally disabled or sickly were nearly impossible to place. Although many siblings were sent together on orphan trains, foster parents could choose to take a single child and separate siblings. The first orphan train was believed to have arrived in Dowagiac. Let me know if Michiganders, if I'm saying that wrong. Michigan, with 45 children on October 1st, 1854. The children were accompanied by E.P. Smith of the Children's Aid Society. Smith presented the children to the audience, saying the boys were hard workers and very handy, and the girls could perform all types of housework. In less than a week, all but 8 children had been placed. Smith traveled with the remaining 8 children to Chicago and put them on a train to Iowa City by themselves, where they were sent to an orphanage run by Reverend C.C. Townsend, who planned to place them with farm families who needed laborers. Thusly, the first expedition was considered such a success, more orphan trains were planned, and the exodus of orphans began their trek west. And this continued on in this manner. More than 250,000 orphan children were dispersed throughout the United States between 1854 and 1929. Some of these people were still alive and like did interviews and stuff. Some of these orphans that were put on these trains. New York State was the leading state for the fostering children from the train, followed by Illinois, Ohio, Iowa, Missouri. Farms were desperate for labor, and the Midwest states adopted the most orphan children from the orphan trains. Ironically, the trains ceased operating in 1929 when the stock market crashed and the Depression began. By this time, the government had instituted the foster care system based on the concept that children living in family settings were better off than in large institutions. All right, let's go back to
trains. And so these orphan trains basically were the continuation of these kids going to indoctrination centers all across the United States. In this case, with the orphan train movement that occurred from the 1850s into the early 1900s, basically because trains weren't even common until the 1830s and really began to be popularized after that. The railway systems were being developed in the East and then in the West, and the Transcontinental Railroad was a bridge to join the East and the
So it's pronounced Dwagic. Okay. I believe you, D. I trust you. Sometimes I'm terrible at pronouncing stuff.
West railway systems between 1863 and 1869. So that's really when all these orphan trains really began to be prominent. But this is just a continuation of what was going on from the time of the beginning of Satan's Little Season in the late 1700s to the early 1800s. Now they just had a better means of transport for child trafficking after breaking up families and their children and placing these youth into schools, universities, orphanages to re-educate them so that their forefathers and what they told them about the millennial reign of Christ, so that those memories would be erased.
Yeah, they gotta send the kids away so that they don't find out about the millennial reign of Christ on orphan trains.
And that these children, through indoctrination techniques, began to believe a new narrative that we see in our history books, and we are the descendants of these transitional children between the millennial kingdom of Christ and Satan's little season. And we are in the season of deception just like they were. We're being indoctrinated from the time of our birth just like they were. We just go on planes, trains, and automobiles now to universities all over the world. But the Harvard University that we saw with John McLean, the professor of ancient and modern history at the time, who rewrote our history books, we're learning that same history that he developed during Satan's little season.
And where are you learning your history from, dude? Like, where's your history coming from? It seems like you're pulling it right out of the keister, rectally sourced. Where's this 1,000-year reign and all this? Where's this other history written down at that you're receiving this from? Or are you receiving this through visions from Christ himself?
And here's some more pictures of the orphan trains. And these are probably staged pictures, but what it represents is certainly true, in the sense that during these first several decades of this transitional time, there's a lot of turmoil throughout the world with wars, the breaking up of families, and the Illuminati becoming prominent in...
See, taking something as tragic as like the orphan train situation and being like, Illuminati, it's just so weird. It's like, oh, the Illuminati had to be involved for things to be awful. Things are awful, they have always been awful somewhere.
Governments throughout the world, from national to state to local government systems, through the healthcare system, through the educational system, through the religious system. It took time for all these people that gave their allegiance, all these big name families that you hear their last names here today. Again, it's all these buildings and cities and all these institutions are being named after. They were the part of this transition time and given prominent roles during Satan's little season. Here's an orphanage in...
And it's just established. It's like Satan's little season is a thing. It's like, we're not arguing about it. It's a thing that happened that we're in right now. And it started in 1776, which basically is, to me, the United States is Satan's little season.
Paris, that's no longer here today. That was demolished. But again, just to show over and over, dirt roads, horse and buggy, and then these magnificent buildings. There's no way that these people, that generation, built that. This is old world millennial kingdom.
Why couldn't they build that? Explain it to me. You can't, just because you can't fathom techniques to build stuff without heavy machinery doesn't mean they didn't have them. Scaffolding was invented a long, long time ago. Way before they had cranes, they had scaffolding that they could build multi-story buildings with the use of. You didn't need cranes just to do that all the time. But then, like Brian Stevens says, baked clay bricks need even less. This doesn't necessarily look like clay, though. It might be. It's hard to tell from this picture, because it could be covered with like a plaster coat, like a stucco.
Built that were used, repurposed for orphans. I think this was before it was destroyed, was later used as a prison. And that's probably what some of these orphan asylums and insane asylums felt like. Here's a picture of the orphans in the Foundling Orphanage in New York City. And you can see these are the children of those who came out of the millennial kingdom of Christ, who were placed into indoctrination centers, who were being taught by those of the Illuminati, those who had allegiance to Satan's little season, to transform these young innocent minds into believing a huge, huge lie. And that's what Satan does. He's the father of lies.
What is the lie, though?
And here's another picture of the inside of an orphanage back in the 1800s. And you can
Alley,
see
man.
the orphans who were parentless and their guardians are caretakers. And again, I want you to know who is in charge of this world right now, who is throughout the governmental systems of this world.
Is it the nurses? Because those look like nurses.
The educational system of this world, healthcare system of this world, the religious system of this world, you name it. The Illuminati from the late 18th century, from 1776 till current, it's taken 248 years, but through this transitional period that we've been going through in this video, from the late 1700s throughout the 1800s into the 20th century, where technology really began to develop, and now through radio, television, the computer age, and internet, we are now on a daily basis being indoctrinated by those within the Illuminati who began with their forefathers.
Within the Illuminati, just because he said so, no evidence for it. Just he feels like it's true.
Of Satan's little season, who are placed in these prominent roles, and we see who these people are. And we see them today in the entertainment industry. We see them every day in the media. But these are who are part of this cult of Satan's little season. And take a good look of the caretakers, their faces, their body habitus, and I probably just need to leave it there.
Okay. Now, I know this from watching his other content. He won't say it out loud. But if you pick up what he's putting down, he's implying that these nurses are trans women. Yes. The people in charge are the trans people. Yes, we are.
But take a good look. And do you see it? Another picture of an orphanage. And this is a picture from the late 1800s, maybe even the early 1900s. But again, you see the kids and you see the caretakers of this orphanage. These pious people, right? That only have good intentions, that just want to take care of these poor little kids who don't have parents, right? I mean, look at this. What's going on there? But more importantly, look at the faces of these guardians. Look at this face. Look at this face. That face. That face. That face especially. That face. That face. That. And tell me what you see. Can you see through the illusion of the deception, this season of deception that we're in? Do you see who is behind it? Do you see what is going on? Is it starting to make sense? What you see on TV every day, what you get bombarded with through the entertainment industry and on television and movies, shows, television programming, they're showing you who they are, and I'm showing you when it happened, how it started, the transition of the early days, and now we know why the world is the way it is, because we're.
Are you guys picking up on this? I hope it's coming through to you that this is the trans agenda.
Towards the end of Satan's little season. the season of deception. It's all an illusion. It's all an illusion. Bitter is made sweet, and sweet is made bitter in this season that we're living in. But just going on to continuing before this video ends, of just a couple more old world buildings, these orphanage, and this one in Paris, for instance. Again, this is worldwide. This is after Napoleonic Wars, the founding by Freemasons of buildings like this, repurposed to place those children into these indoctrination centers.
And if anybody's got any doubts that maybe thinks that I'm like, oh, you're just inferring that because you think everything's about talking about trans people. This video he goes on, this is part 2 of this. I'm not going to watch the whole thing, but he goes, let me find it, because there's a certain picture that he's talking about, and it makes it, yeah, there we go. It makes it very clear.
Going back to my last video, looking at the guardians and caretakers of these orphan houses, it makes you wonder what is behind the veil right here. Is everything as innocent as it looks here? This looks bizarre to me. This says Charity Bazaar, Love Bazaar, and this is truly bizarre in what I'm seeing here. This does not look right, to say the least. But this is a flyer from the St. Vincent Infant Asylum. And I showed you who was in charge of a lot of these orphan asylums, and their dress, and under the veil what they really were. And I think the same goes for here, looking just at the profile, and the hands, and the shoulder width, and everything else. So you can kind of use your imagination a little bit if you don't know what I'm saying.
Oh
again,
my gosh. I have struck gold finding this freaking conspiracy channel. The trans agenda, you guys. Oh my gosh.
That's who is in charge this time. This is a big cult in Satan's little season. And they have their own symbols. They have their own rituals. And they show it right in front of you. And we see it today in our media. We see the same people in our media today. We see them in leadership roles of world governments, their spouses, the first ladies.
He's talking about the French First Lady, Macron. She's not trans, but yeah, there's the conspiracy that she is. And the Michelle Obama.
We see them as heads in healthcare and education. Just look at the leaders of the United States healthcare and educational systems.
So, did you guys know that it was going this way? Did anybody foresee that this was going to take a full frickin' tilt into the trans agenda? Did that? Did you see it coming? I sure didn't. When I started looking into orphan trains, I was like, huh, this orphan train thing seems kind of interesting and kind of like wacky. I'm gonna watch it, and I'm like, how the hell did this become about trans people? And sometimes I think that maybe, you got trans people on your brain because it's all you freaking. And I've had people say that to me before, like, oh, you just see transphobia everywhere you look, Bree. It's like, dude, I was just watching a video about orphan trains, and then shoulder width, transvestigation of old art.
See what I mean. But continuing, another orphan asylum. This is on 74th Street and Bloomingdale Road in New York City at the time, and you can see the New York Orphan Asylum. Again, why would they build these glorious buildings with these magnificent spires, these arches, the cathedral look?
Because they had money to burn. The church had money to burn.
Where they only have horse and buggy, no modern construction equipment. But why would they build something so grand and glorious for orphans? Again,
they didn't build it for orphans. They make it pretty for the people who paid for it. for their people who donated. So when they donate the money, they can say, look at the beautiful buildings that we're putting together to care for the poor and needy, and people will be like, ooh.
The Freemasons, the Illuminati, found these buildings. They repurposed them. They renovated them to transform them into orphan asylums. Asylum is a word that used to mean a safe refuge or shelter. But these asylums for the insane and orphans were far from that. These were re-educational centers.
Why would re-educational centers be in the fancy buildings? If these fancy buildings were so desirable, why wouldn't they put government stuff in them?
And there's no telling what all occurred during these time periods in all these different orphanages during the early part of Satan's little season. Here's another orphan asylum. It says this site is to be demolished at the bottom here, the PE Orphan Asylum. But this, like many others, were demolished. You can see beautiful grand structures, but then modernized, transformed to conform it to.
The modernized was the fire escape on the outside. I don't know about that.
An orphanage during the time of Satan's little season and during this transitional time where families were broken up in order for the new narrative to be proclaimed throughout.
You gotta make sure you tell us that, don't say it with your whole chest. By the transes, we broke up the families. The transes did.
Out the world, and those who didn't go along with it ended up in places like this. Here's another one in New York City. And again, this is a same picture twice, but you can see just the beautiful architecture, the spires.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this is the Hebrew Orphan Asylum that I was referring to earlier on Amsterdam Avenue. I think this has been demolished too since this photograph. But again, this huge building.
Does he not know, like, urban renewal was a big thing in the early 20th century? Like, they tore down all these, the old architecture and replaced it with new modern steel-framed architecture with concrete.
This is an old world building. This is built not in the early 1800s for the housing of orphans. This was built during the Millennial Kingdom for the purposes of housing believers, those within the kingdom, for the to glorify God, to proclaim
the transes put the Christians in asylums, and if you let us, we're going to do it again. Is the message that we're supposed to pick up here?
The Word of God, and to continue the spread of the good news of Jesus Christ to the world. But after the end of that kingdom,
right? He's like talking about this is it didn't even pick up on that, but yeah, Hebrew Orphan Asylum. There's a flavor of anti-Semitism here with the transphobia
on earth in the beginning of Satan's little season. This was used for other purposes by the Illuminati. Again, another picture. This was a Protestant orphan asylum. So now we're starting to further divide not only skin color, ethnicity, boys, girls, but also religious beliefs. You know, like I said, there's so many.
Those are churches are the main organizations that fund orphanages. Like me telling you this shouldn't be at your age shouldn't be the first time that you come to be aware of that knowledge. Yeah, historically, churches have funded and run orphanages. Yeah, there's state orphanages too, and like I mentioned earlier in the last video we're watching, that there were orphanages run by the crown, but yeah, they not a lot of them run by the Illuminati or the Masons. Unfortunately, it's just that it just doesn't pan out. It's been you guys the whole time in charge of these places, breaking apart families, as you claim.
False churches, gospels that came into the world in the early 1800s. Just in the United States, you see the beginning of Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, Seventh-day Adventism. You see all these false religions come in during this time.
Wait, there's more than one religion? Does Dad know? Yeah, he's about to go about calling
period. And just further and further segregate the churches. Satan's minions coming into the churches, into the seminaries, unawares, to divide and conquer. That's why we have so many different types of churches today. In Satan's little season, the church has been segregated and divided so much. It is so weak that everybody within it practically is spiritually blind to what's going on. And then finally, this is the Brooklyn Orphan Asylum, I think, that we saw at the beginning, and this is the kitchen of it. So this is repurposed old world building that has been repurposed into a kitchen. I don't know if it has new flooring or if this is original flooring. And we talked
I know that the checker pattern was part of the clowns or Nephilim thing.
About the checkerboard flooring, and was this an actual design within old world buildings of the Millennial Kingdom that the Freemasons simply adopted and then used as their symbology, or was this something new to this New World Order and was part of the renovations of these old world buildings into something of use in Satan's little season? So finally, why were all these orphanages needed in the 1800s in New York City? Orphanage after orphanages you can see throughout this slide, and this is just a few of these old world buildings.
And I mean, we just went over why there were so many orphans in the eastern United States in the mid 1800s, but obviously there was the transits that separated the families,
converted into orphanages during this time. Why were so many needed in New York specifically? Well, I think we see this in New York because New York was a hub of child trafficking in the early 1800s during the early part of Satan's little season, when all
but it really wasn't child trafficking then. It was, but it was the kids were literally coming for work. They were looking for work. Children worked back then. Like as soon as you were able to walk and had motor skills to do things with your hands, you were put to work.
All these rebellions were going on throughout the world. Again, as I mentioned previously, after the release of Satan from the abyss and the establishment of the New World Order through the help of his followers within the Illuminati and Freemasonry that were placed in positions of power, that these wars that were going on simultaneously were a result of this rebellion from the millennial reign of Christ. And that, for instance...
Hey, Speed, you need to make your stream... I can send my audience to you, but you need to make it... you need to allow it to be done, because when I go to add your stream on for the redirect... it gives me a message that says that redirect privilege is needed. Ask Answers in Atheism to add to their live redirect list in their community settings. So yeah, I can redirect my audience to you. I've had about enough of the orphan trains for the moment, though. We're gonna wrap this up here. So, did I shock you guys? Did that come out of left field, this last 10 minutes of this video, where all of a sudden it was like, hey, look at these people. They're very clearly trans. Did that catch you off guard? Let me know in the comments. So, yeah, we got one more segment of the show to go. It's really short, though. It's Bestiary, which I've been trying to pare down to be under 10 minutes to wrap up the show with something fun and light. So we are going to be moving over there. So to my folks who are here just to get weird with it on Wednesday with me, that's our orphan trains and orphan asylums and the great nation of Tartaria. Hope you enjoyed it. Please remember to be kind. Take care, and we'll see you next time.